Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this workshop under Helsinki Principle 6 on the role of Ministers of Finance in NDC development, review and implementation. I'm Christian Aigenzuki. I'm the Secretary for the Secretariat of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action and lead economist at the World Bank. I'm delighted to be here and serve as your moderator for the discussions today. So we will start with a high-level panel, with a high-level segment, and then proceed to a panel for more technical discussions, where we'll hear from various country examples and best practice on NDCs. All of you should have received the agenda and the link to the recently released report from the coalition on Ministers of Finance and the NDCs stepping up for climate action. I reread the report yesterday and was again struck by an overwhelming sentiment. With all the, it's so compelling that with all the tools that ministers of finance have at their disposal in terms of macro, fiscal, budget, public financial management, it's so compelling that they should be involved. It's just hard for me to conceive that ministers of finance were not so involved in the past. And to me, this is the clearest indication that this is an idea whose time has come. And so, we're delighted to have this workshop this morning and to see the continuing progress. On behalf of the coalition, I just want to thank the NDC partnership in advance for all the preparations and the work, and thank the whole team, the country champions, for their leadership, on this critical agenda. So before we get started, let me just note a few housekeeping items. So, users, please change your Zoom name to an attendee name and organization. You can do this by hovering over your name, and you'll either see 3 dots in the corner or an option for more. If you click there, you'll be given an option to rename, and then we can see, all the attendees. We can see your name and organization, and that would be very helpful. So all attendees will be muted for the duration of the webinar, but there will be the Q&A function will be operating. And one last thing to note: the webinar will be recorded. So without further ado, we can turn to proceed with the program. And start with Trevor Anderson, who's the Sherpa for Jamaica on the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. He is also the Principal Director of the Economic Management Division in the Ministry of Finance and Public Service. So over to you, Trevor.
Apologies, Trevor. I believe that you're on mute.
Are you hearing me now?
Yes, please proceed.
Okay.
Thank you, Trevor.
Here we go. Let me first acknowledge the progress to date of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action under the leadership of co-chairs Finland and Chile. It is evident that a significant amount of work has been done in shaping the development and evolution of the coalition. Let me reiterate Jamaica's commitment to the success of the coalition. Jamaica has been an active member since our commitment to join at the IMF World Bank spring meetings in 2019. I would also like to acknowledge the leadership of Uganda as co-champion country for Helsinki Principle 6. I know the staff at the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service and the Office of the Prime Minister have enjoyed championing the issue of nationally determined contribution with you. Also, thanks to NDC Partnership Support Unit and the World Bank for the continued support. It is certainly an opportune time to be discussing the NDCs and the role of ministries of finance specifically, and the larger issue of tackling climate change, even as countries around the world are grappling with the COVID-19 impact. The pandemic further highlights the importance of addressing how to build resilience and minimize vulnerability. I now turn to building a resilient Jamaica 2.0. We live in a world of increasingly unpredictable and complex risks, and we need to be much better prepared to deal with the interlinked impacts of ongoing issues such as climate change and deal with the inevitable changes and challenges of today. In response to the current pandemic, the government of Jamaica established an economic recovery task force that has set out various initiatives aimed at rebuilding a resilient Jamaica 2.0. Jamaica's challenges predate COVID-19. The pandemic has simply put the spotlight on these issues and magnified the scope and complexity of the policy responses required. We have recognized the need to, among other things, sustain and even accelerate further macro fiscal and public sector reform, further improve the business climate, boost competitiveness, and deepen local supply chains, as well as strengthen economic, social, and climate resilience. The important link between building a resilient Jamaica 2.0 and sustainable growth means incorporating the management of risk and building resilience into our national strategies for growth and development. As such, ministers and ministries of finance are central to this discourse on building resilience, setting up ourselves for success. As challenging as the times may be, it also presents the opportunity to embrace reform with ambition. Countries have an opportunity to step up ambition in the national climate targets in line with the additional financial resources that are to be made available through the global fiscal effort for the recovery. Jamaica's enhanced NDC, I'm proud to share that Jamaica submitted its enhanced 2020 NDC on June 30, 2020, to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The enhanced NDC shows greater climate ambition and scope. It involves ramping up of renewables in power generation by 2030 and an expansion in sectoral scope for emissions reductions in forestry, waste, water, and transport. Jamaica received support from the World Bank to undertake various economic and emissions modeling exercises to craft the enhanced NDC. An ambitious climate plan certainly requires input from ministries of finance, and this is particularly important for countries such as Jamaica, given our focus on maintaining fiscal discipline and macroeconomic stability. Jamaica is also ramping up efforts to establish the necessary national structure among key institutions, those being the Ministry of Finance, the Planning Institute of Jamaica, and the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, to align economic recovery efforts with NDCs and Vision 2030, with embedded climate economic advisors and interagency coordination. Utilization of our public financial management systems to build resilience becomes important. Integrating climate action within a country's public financial management system elevates the fiscal relevance of climate change to a country's economy. And not only in recycling fiscal risk, but viewing climate change related initiatives as catalysts in growth and development strategies. The report speaks to this issue and how many countries have used various entry points within their PFM systems to address climate action. Jamaica's disaster risk financing strategy. As you will have read in the report, for Jamaica, we have recently focused on building a robust disaster risk financing strategy. I must highlight that in responding to the current pandemic, one of the facilities that has been enhanced under our disaster risk financing strategy, the contingencies fund, from a 20-year balance of US $750,000 to US $14 million. Our deliberate approach to financing against disaster risk provided an important buffer in our response to COVID-19. Therefore, as we set ourselves up for success in building resilience, it is important to understand how our PFM systems can be better aligned to tackle climate action. Strengthening and diversifying climate finance. Islands are still challenged by insufficient accessibility of climate finance to meet the pathways required to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. A global shift is needed to make climate financing accessible and fit for purpose. There is not enough financing mechanisms to provide insurance against vulnerability. Middle-income countries fall between the cracks as many existing climate finance mechanisms are not geared towards middle-income countries. And thirdly, there is a need for low-cost capital for resilient investments, and developing countries require support to translate NDCs into investment plans, quantify their needs, and build their national and institutional capacities to access funding. Jamaica and the Green Climate Fund. The government of Jamaica has engaged the Green Climate Fund to leverage resources to support private sector mobilization for the development of climate change adaptation and mitigation projects and programs. Not only is it important to diversify climate finance at the international level, it is also critical to review the necessary international support to help countries unlock private sector financing within their own economies. In conclusion, I encourage SIDS and other developing countries to continue to be visible and active in various international platforms. Jamaica has benefited from its membership to the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. The diverse country experiences continue to enhance our knowledge of integrating climate action in PFM systems. Jamaica will continue to support the efforts of the coalition as it amplifies its message of the role of ministries of finance in climate action. Additionally, co-champions of Helsinki Principle 6, I encourage countries to submit their enhanced NDCs. There is a real window of opportunity to be deliberate in linking climate action with economic, social, and climate resilience. In building a resilient Jamaica 2.0, we recognize the importance of this approach. I encourage you to read the report and let us continue this important dialogue of NDCs, climate action, and the role of ministries of finance. Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor. And to Jamaica for the leadership on the enhanced NDCs, despite the increased challenges of the fallout from COVID-19. The NDCs will have a central role to play also in supporting the green recovery. So we look forward to seeing how that unfolds. Let us now turn and hear from the Honorable Matia Kasaija, Minister of Finance, Planning and Economic Development of Uganda.
Honorable Niger Clark, Minister of Finance and with the Public Service of Jamaica, Coalition of Finance Ministers, co-chairs, members of the coalition, development partners, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to be addressing you in this forum, and I want to state that Uganda is one of the countries that is committed to combating climate change through implementation of the objectives set out in the Paris Agreement Our commitment is reinforced by being one of the founder members of the Finance Ministers Coalition on Climate Action. We want to pledge that we shall continue to engage in efforts to address climate change through our economic and financial policies, operate the national frameworks and mandates to support implementation of the 6 Helsinki principles, and engage in peer learning and knowledge exchange. Interestingly, today, we've been considering a cabinet a paper prepared by some of my officers where we want to borrow money and we are talking of nothing but climate change. That money is meant to come and help us to address our climatic challenges, particularly the problem of deforestation and settling in wetlands. As part of the core mandate of designing and implementing sound macroeconomic policies and public finances as ministries of finance, we have a central role to play in supporting our countries to design and implement the next generation of the nationally determined contributions. As the involvement of ministries of finance in the NDC process is still evolving in most countries, we can learn from each other by encouraging peer learning and knowledge exchange among the coalition members. Accordingly, having issued papers that guide on how ministries of finance can get involved in climate change mitigation and adaptation is a big milestone. I therefore want to express my sincere gratitude to all members of the working group of 6 of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action for spearheading the production of this very important paper. The paper clearly demonstrates through country experiences that the nationally determined contributions developed in close collaboration with ministries of finance are fiscally sound. They consider the macroeconomic factors and wider financial private sector implications. In addition, mainstreaming NDCs into national PFM systems, public finance management systems, ensure that economic and physical externalities of the climate agenda are factored into growth and development strategies. This process allows ministries of finance to deploy their tools such as annual budgeting tools, macroeconomic forecasting tools, monitoring and evaluation systems, and public finance management laws and regulations to drive climate action in a coordinated way. I therefore implore our member countries to leverage on the case studies demonstrated in the paper to guide the development of the next set of NDCs so that we are more realistic and consider financial and macroeconomic impacts. This will ease their implementation. Special appreciation goes to the NDC Partnership Support Unit and the World Bank team, who have worked alongside the country champions to deliver this document. I wish everybody a fruitful discussion during this webinar. Thank you.
Many thanks for the strong motivation from Uganda on the agenda and for the workshop. We really appreciate the strong support and deep engagement from Uganda. So let us then turn to Pekka Morin, who is Special Representative of the Finnish Minister of Finance on the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action and co-chair of the coalition. Over to you, Pekka.
Thank you, Christian. And obviously, I would like to bring the best wishes on behalf of the ministers of Chile and Finland, and thanks to the NDC partnership for organizing this event and for contributing to the coalition's work actively. Also, many thanks to Jamaica and Uganda for their kind remarks and the fact that they are actually playing an extremely active role in the coalition. This is about learning and showing example, and about being active in participating in the work. That's where the benefits come from. The coalition released a report that has been referred to a couple of times. That was in July. It's really about the finance ministry's involvement in the NDC process. And this is not self-evident. I think the countries have, in the report, have made a useful contribution. And that is a route to further awareness of how things could be improved, and the horizontal aspects of climate change could be taken more into the policy designs. I would like to just make 3 points on the coalition's role about the economic and financial planning. Firstly, why is it important? Quite simply, because it's early days. No country's finance ministry can brag about being in the lead, ready about mainstreaming climate into the economic policies. It's still under development. We are testing tools, developing them. And here we also rely on the support of academia and international institutions. Secondly, the change can't happen without economic policy. That's clear. This will bring us a lot of advantages, competitive advantages, adaptation advantages to the inevitable impact of climate change. So those who are early movers will benefit for sure. Markets are already adjusting. For the finance ministers and economic policy design viewpoint, the obvious benefit is that we need to understand better the economic impact of climate change in connection to our societies and economies. So this is necessary to make the change happen. But finally, I would like to just say a few points about how actually the coalition of finance ministers can help. It's been impressive to see how active countries have started to contribute to the work in the past couple of months. We've had almost 25 events in the past couple of months on workshops with very active involvement. Why are countries so eager to participate? First, finance ministers together, they bring, the coalition brings finance ministers together to mainstream economic policies. We are in a position to acquire the best analytical expertise. We rely on the institutions like World Bank, OECD, IMF, NDC partnership, UN colleagues. There is a long list, about 20 partners. They will help us. We work together to develop better tools. And this is a very fundamental issue. I give an example: macroeconomic modeling, green budgeting. This is very early days. We are just testing the tools, but it will take some years to develop them, but I'm sure we will get there and the results will show later. Finally, we will help countries in developing best practices on how to actually involve the finance ministries. This is particularly important on Principle 6. This is important as there is really strong horizontal aspect, and finance ministries are not typically or necessarily taking even part in the design of these policies. So there's a lot of motivation there for the members and new members as well. We will be organizing, the Sherpas will prepare this ministerial meeting on the 12th October. We will present ministers the progress made and also on Principle 6. And I hope that today's discussions could give some useful food of thought in preparation for the ministerial meeting. We are also moving towards COP26, and we also do our best to help our colleagues, the finance ministries in the UK and Italy, holding the presidency, to support the work from finance ministry's angle. So I wish you a good seminar, and thanks for all the participants. I look forward to the panels today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pekka, for your remarks, highlighting the clear rationale for finance ministries to be engaged on the NDCs, and also for the background and framing of the overall discussion through the coalition. And thanks also for your leadership of the coalition, strong leadership together with Lorena Palomo as co-chairs of the coalition. So let us then move forward to Andrea Meza, the Director of Climate Change, Ministry of Environment and Energy of Costa Rica, who is also the co-chair of the NDC partnership. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Christian, and good morning to everyone, or good afternoon, depending on in the part of the world where you are. But it's a pleasure being here and speaking on behalf of the NDC partnership. I would like to thank His Excellency, Mr. Matia Kasaya from Uganda, from his clear words and inspiring words. Also, I would like to thank Mr. Trevor Anderson from Jamaica, and both of them for their leadership in this task force. Of course, I would like to thank also to Pekka, Moren, and Lorena. I think they're doing a great job as co-chairs of the Coalition of Finance of Ministries. It's incredible to see all the work that has been developed. And also, of course, we'd like to thank all the countries that will be sharing their experiences, their views here in this workshop. I think that this is what the Coalition of Ministers of Finance is about, as well as the NDC partnership. We are platforms. We want to collaborate. We want to support each other in the implementation of the NDCs and of climate action. The importance of ministries of finance in driving the economy towards sustainable development, low carbon and climate resilient future is critical. I think that when we are in the climate community, and I'm part of this climate community, most of the time we are really concentrating our efforts in which are the right technologies, a lot of technical issues. How can we engage the private sector? How can we engage other stakeholders? But then we realize that we need to mobilize resources to do this transformation. And this is where we see the critical engagement of ministries of finance and planning, because this is, as we have been saying a lot, this is not an environmental issue. This is a development issue, a development agenda. And I think that it's incredible. I think it was Christian, the one who said that we didn't encourage the participation of these two ministries in the beginning, but this is the time. And I think that the coalition is doing a great job in engaging these critical institutional stakeholders in this process. We are in 2020, 5 years after the Paris Agreement adoption, and this is the time when we need to present our NDCs, our revised NDCs or our enhanced NDCs. And again, we see the leadership from Jamaica, from Chile, putting these NDCs there. We are also, as Costa Rica, working in the enhancement of our NDC, and we will present it this year. But again, it's critical right now with the pandemic. How can we also elaborate and prioritize some investments that can deliver green jobs, blue jobs, that can also allow us to phase out of this so complicated crisis? And again, the participation of these two ministers is critical in this endeavor. As co-chair of the NDC partnership, together with my Dutch colleague, we feel privileged to work with the coalition. And we have been supported the coalition since its inception, and under the leadership of Jamaica and Uganda, has supported the implementation of Principle 6 of the Santiago Action Plan. And we really welcome the report, and we are eager also to learn from this report and to be sharing this lesson with other countries. And I would just like to make a reflection on what does the NDC partnership do and how do we work. Countries of the NDC partnership are using whole of a government approach to translate NDCs into investment plans and bankable projects, to mainstream climate change into government planning and budgeting processes, to improve enabling environments to attract national and international private finance, and to track expenditure and assets implementation. And I think that there is a lot of areas where we need to work together with the coalition of ministries of finance. But considering this whole of a government approach, it is one of the reasons of why 68% of the NDC membership countries request support specifically to integrating NDCs into national planning, budgets, and revenue streams. This includes integrating climate finance into public budgets and expedition frameworks, climate finance tracking, sustainable public procurement guidelines, and other areas related to what the ministries of finance and planning need to address and cover. So again, thank you, Jamaica and Uganda, for their leadership, and we look forward for the exchange to then and all the collaboration efforts between the coalition and the partnership and all the countries in these enhancement processes. Back to you, Christian.
Thank you, Andrea, for your remarks and for the strong motivation. It's especially compelling to hear that such a big percentage share of NDC partnership membership, when they seek support from the NDC partnership, it's precisely in these areas on the macro fiscal connection with climate. And thank you also for your engagement and support through the NDC partnership to the coalition and on this agenda. So without further ado, we're a few minutes behind schedule, so we should jump straight into the panel discussion. Perhaps in the panel discussion, we'll be looking at the background of various country cases, trying to understand better, hear more about why integrating climate change into public financial management systems has been an important step for the ministries of finance. What are some of the sort of concrete economic benefits, and where are the entry points for mainstreaming climate? So this is a shared journey, and we look forward to hearing from the panelists. A couple of housekeeping items to start. So during the panel, all attendees will be muted and the chat box has been disabled. So please drop your questions into the Q&A box where NDCP colleagues will be collating them, and we'll try to address them as best possible at the end of the panel. If you joined us by phone, unfortunately, you won't be able to view the presentation or ask questions using the Q&A box. But if you do have questions during the presentation, please feel free to email us at events@ndcpartnership, all one word, .org, and we will include it. And this email, the email address was also in your registration confirmation. So please do go ahead and send your questions in via email if you have called in by phone. So without further ado, let us move forward on the program and turn to Sam Ngumi, who is from the Macroeconomic Policy Department of the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development of Uganda. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you very much, Christian. I would like also to start by thanking the ministers from the two countries, Jamaica and Uganda, who have ably defined what we're doing as the Finance Ministers Coalition, and also defined NDCs, and somehow given us more power why we should do this more. And that's encouraging, and we shall do more work. That's what I want to promise them. I would like also to thank the co-chairs of the Finance Ministers Coalition for the good introduction to this paper, and also to thank NDC Partnership and World Bank that have worked with us to prepare this very, very important paper, which my job this morning, this afternoon, where you are, I forgot to say good afternoon, good morning, but this is what it is. Wherever you are, my job is to introduce to you this paper, this very, very important paper that you've heard the key speakers talking about, a paper that is Ministries of Finance and Nationally Determined Contribution, Stepping Up for Climate Change. This, next slide. This paper basically is on climate change. And what I want to start with the known. Climate change is real. This is what we say every time. And for us, like in Uganda and other countries, we've seen climate change impact on societies and communities. We've seen this through rising water levels of water bodies, of lakes, and we've seen this displacing people. We've seen this through increment of pests and diseases that have destabilized communities. We've also seen this in form of droughts that have created famines and displaced populations. The impact to this also, for example, I'll give you an example in Uganda. In 2016, 2017, we had a long drought. And for us in Ministry of Finance, we realized that there was a drop in our economic growth significantly. So the impact of climate change is big. But the good news is that we have a set of actions that are prepared by different countries, and this set of actions are called nationally determined contributions, as you already had, the actions to mitigate climate change impact and also make populations adapt to climate change, NDCs. These are good actions. However, what we realized is that for these actions to be financially feasible, we need Ministry of Finance to be at the center stage to work with agencies and ministries that are preparing this. We realized that before, the engagement of Ministry of Finance in different countries was not as expected, much as it was at different levels. And this is why we write this paper to make sure that we bring Ministry of Finance at the forefront, given the mandate of Ministry of Finance in terms of budget allocation, budget preparation, and also Ministry of Finance being a ministry that has enough tools to do macroeconomic analysis where we can base decisions to take in terms of budgeting and resource allocation. And when we go back to the coalition of finance ministers, a coalition that has 6 principles, the 6th principle is basically to bring Ministry of Finance into review, implementation, and development of NDCs. And this is what we're doing. But again, when you look at the strategy of the coalition, one of them is to share experience, good practice, and also share challenges where possible. So this paper is basically a paper that is strategically for the coalition of Ministry of Finance, but addressing climate change and making sure Ministry of Finance are engaged, are in forefront of preparing NDC. Next slide. As the next slide is coming, the major objective of this paper was to provide practical guidance on how Ministry of Finance can effectively engage in review and implementation by highlighting experiences and lessons learned from ministries and from ministries of finance in the development and review of NDC and implementation of NDC. So this is just a guide. We're getting experience from different countries. We are putting across the best practices. We are putting across what has done well. And we want member countries of the coalition, 52 countries, member countries, but also other countries to get to see and look at how we can all, as Minister of Finance, get involved. This guide does not replace the guide for NDC development. I would like to emphasize that. We have a guide for NDC development, but it's a paper that is helping to bring in Minister of Finance in implementation and review. 2, for this paper to have this objective effectively made, we had 2 questions to answer, and these questions have been answered. 1, how Minister of Finance can engage in the review of the current NDCs and the development of the new set. Two, ways in which NDCs can be mainstreamed in the public finance management system. These are the questions that we had at our forefront. Like the paper is a joint effort of the working group of the Coalition of Finance Ministers Action, group number 6. We have 6 principles in the coalition, and each coalition has a working group. This is working group number 6, which is working on NDCs and Ministry of Finance. Like it's put there, I'd already said the working group was led by Jamaica and Uganda. I'm proud I'm Ugandan, so we led this, and Jamaica. And also we had NDC partners and the World Bank supporting us. But four countries, Chile, Colombia, Ireland, and Philippines, were very, very instrumental in providing information and experience. Next. Like I said before, we have different countries at different levels of engaging Minister of Finance as far as NDC preparation and review is concerned. So what we wanted to see first, how is this? Is it different between countries? And if it's different, how different is it? One, we had a survey instrument and we sent it to the 52 member countries. Out of the 52 member countries of the coalition, 36 responded. And here this, what did they say? 49% said Minister of Finance take a lead role as far as development, preparation, and implementation of NDCs are concerned. 81% said what Minister of Finance work with line ministries. 50% said 50% provide technical input. 72% reported that Minister of Finance engages in climate-informed appraisal and analysis of policies, while 39% reported that Minister of Finance coordinate technical assistance and financing. This alone gave us kind of showed us that there are different levels, and therefore justified the paper's position to write a guide that can help all countries that are engaged in NDCs and finance take up this and be at the forefront. In addition to the champion countries for the coalition, that's Uganda and Jamaica, members Chile, Colombia, Philippines, contributed the experience in having Minister of Finance get the experience in what they've done, have Minister of Finance get involved in NDC preparation. We also did a detailed review of literature in terms of planning documents, in terms of budgets, in terms of NDCs, and the national determined contributions for each country. We reviewed them and we saw what they had done right and what needed to be done. So this is what the report is bringing about. We had key informants from Ministry of Finance for the 6 countries mentioned, and also as other countries, but also we talked to NDC partnerships country offices. Next. This is a long story because the way it's put, it is a story that if you put in a scientific jargon, environment jargon, many people would not understand. And our key target for this paper is basically policymakers and basically those in the ministries of finance, because we want them to move forward to see that whatever is put in NDCs has a financial backup, has the macroeconomic analysis, and is given budget allocation at some point, not have over-ambitious actions that are not budgeted for, that are not costed. So what did we do, the approach? We decided to have a short and accessible document for policymakers. You realize our document is the body is almost 12 pages, but we have annexes and we introduce people to different literature. we decided to use as much as possible Minister of Finance language and terms. We use case studies and lessons from existing studies to develop and implement NDCs, and we give reference documents that point to other substantive references that people can use. So these are the four different approaches that we had, but all of them intended to make sure that the paper is easily understood by our target population. Next. This paper, to be understood by everybody, like I would say, our target population, our target group, policymakers, is structured as follows. It has four sections. One of them is addressing the question of why ministries of finance are needed in NDC preparation, implementation, review, how and where ministries of finance can be involved, review and development of NDCs with input from Minister of Finance, and integration of NDCs into the public finance management system. This paper is going to be next. The paper will be presented by the different panelists who will present country experiences and what has been done, and also bring out lessons learned, but they will bring out challenges which we shall be able to discuss. I want to tell you, I've gone through the paper. I've been in preparation of this paper. I've read it and read it. It is a paper worth reading if you're from the Ministry of Finance. And I would like to thank all the participants that are in here today. And I know probably after 5 years, we shall see, like we said, if you look at UNFCCC now, we are supposed to submit our NDCs by the end of this year. Probably our new set of NDCs are going to be more and more realistic and will be much easily implemented, and we shall get results. I want once again to thank all of you for coming. I would like to encourage you to listen into experiences, and later on we shall have a fruitful discussion. I want to thank you, Christian, and everybody. Thank you so much.
Sam, thank you so much for the overview of the paper and framing the discussion of the country best practices. It was really quite an effort and an achievement to put together that paper, and we're delighted to see it released. And underpinning the other thing that you emphasized, which is the importance of sharing country experience. So we look forward to hearing more on the country experience from the rest of the panelists. I should remind, we've had a very rich discussion so far and set of remarks, but we are running behind schedule. So if the next panelists would please keep your comments to 5 minutes, that would be very much appreciated so that we can end on time. And also in particular, we have Amar coming up, who is coming out of another engagement for a set amount of time, so we'll have a hard stop there to make sure that we're able to bring him in. So let's turn to Anaiti Mills, who's Climate Finance Advisor in the Office of the Prime Minister of Jamaica, for her remarks. We're especially interested in understanding better how political leadership can help accelerate resilience building in line with the NDC targets. Anaiti, over to you, please.
Thank you, Christian, and good morning and good evening, everyone. Thank you again for providing Jamaica and facilitating Jamaica on this space. I have to apologize on behalf of Minister Nigel Clark for his last-minute call to the front lines. Let's put it that way. As we all grapple with the impacts of the pandemic and the crisis that evolves on a day-to-day basis. Thank you to Sam and the team in Uganda. It has been absolutely fantastic and wonderful to work with them, to engage with Uganda, to learn from the African region and from other regions in the world. So let me jump right on it. Christian, you gave me 5 minutes, so I'm gonna definitely try to live to your expectation. So we are coincidentally talking about coordination and leadership in Jamaica today. And just to provide quick context to that, Jamaica's economic progress is constantly under threat because of natural disasters and the impacts of climate change in very important sectors of the economy, such as tourism and agriculture. On average, in the long term, the government of Jamaica is going to need to cover for losses of approximately 121 million US dollars annually, or close to 1% of GDP, to address only contingent liabilities related to hurricanes or flooding. We're taking out the other liabilities that come with climate change. Adding the impact of COVID-19 pandemic to the mix, as recently predicted by the IMF, we're looking at an economic contraction of 3 to 5%. Consequently, the country's disaster risk profile makes unforeseen expenditures almost a given at any point in time. As members of the Coalition of Finance Ministers and country champions for Helsinki Principle 6, the team in Jamaica consider important to highlight two country experiences in the report that we believe illustrate aspects that are important in moving forward with the new economic reality and the need for urgent climate action. You heard from our Sherpa, Trevor Anderson, when he was describing the National Disaster Risk Financing Strategy. We decided to highlight that on the report, and this is the result of a partnership with the World Bank, with the intent of improving, the intent of this disaster risk financing strategy is to improve the government of Jamaica public financial management and risk management frameworks in order to mitigate the financial risks of natural disaster. This type of financial protection was developed using a multi-layer risk approach that combines different instruments for different layers of risk. Now, the reason I am pointing this out, and I'm hoping our audience is going to look more detail into the report and look more carefully, is because this particular experience and the strategy follow a comprehensive diagnostic analysis using macroeconomic planning and probabilistic risk modeling. Pekka earlier today mentioned the use of modeling tools as an important instrument or an important strategy in moving forward if we want NDCs to be better and more effectively mainstream in fiscal management. Jamaica also enhanced the NDC. In the enhanced NDC that we recently submitted, used top-notch and very innovative modeling software that enables the assessment of the energy sector and emissions reductions in the sector. We believe, therefore, that the use of this kind of tools and modeling tools should be more promoted in order to obtain more granularity that will allow countries to answer broader policy questions like how to translate NDC's targets into concrete actions and projects and policies at the macroeconomic level, and or how to prioritize enabling policy and investment in and budget planning. The second aspect that the team wanted to feature in the report, and perhaps the most important for us, is coordination and leadership. At the international level, and I'm very apologetic that we couldn't hear from Minister Clark today, but Minister Clark last year at the World Bank and IMF spring meetings endorsed the creation of the coalition and the launch of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action as an important platform for the country to ensure continued knowledge exchange and best practices in planning concrete effective policy and tax measures, such as the disaster risk financing policy. This was something that he advocated for. He has been very vocal about the improvement of public financial management and risk management in order to mitigate financial risks that at any type of disaster will pose on the Jamaican economy that could also hinder the country's capacity to attain low carbon development. This is the type of leadership thinking that has placed Jamaica in a position to be able to respond effectively to the pandemic so far, and is also the type of thinking that has encouraged the team at the technical level to get so involved in the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. Similarly, the Prime Minister, Andrew Holness, also co-led last year, along with President Macron and the Emir of Qatar, the Climate Finance and Carbon Pricing track for the UN Climate Action Summit. This mandate provided Jamaica a seat in the table when discussing global climate finance, but also provided the opportunity for the country to advocate for fit for purpose, increase equitable, fair, inclusive, and enhanced access to finance from both public and private sector. This is absolutely essential for low carbon transformation, adaptation, resilience. That is now more important than ever. At the national level, these achievements, including the recent submission of the enhanced and a far more ambitious NDC, despite the pandemic and the global challenges, are a result of team effort and interagency coordination. And let me stop right here, because it would not be fair not to acknowledge the team, including Sherpa Trevor Anderson, Dr. Karel Samura at the Ministry of Finance, the Climate Change Division team at the Ministry of Economic Growth led under Ms. Yoname Gordon, the team at the Planning Institute of Jamaica, and of course, all the team is spearheaded by the Office of the Prime Minister. This has been a complete team effort. With these efforts and many others that are happening as we speak, the country's leadership is therefore continuously making the necessary efforts to act on climate and promoting collective action globally. In closing, Jamaica's resolve to boost emergency COVID-19 recovery and response while building up climate resilience shows leadership that should be supported and encouraged through sustained international cooperation. The government has taken the bull by the horns by setting up robust policy frameworks, processes, ambitious data-based targets, but we are the first ones to recognize that we cannot do it alone. We recognize the continued support of important partners such as the World Bank and the NDC partnership, along with other international partners who have stepped up to support the country on many fronts, especially on climate action. With that, I thank you so much for this space and look forward for the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, NIT, for your remarks and Jamaica's leadership and readiness to share experience, and the priorities of Jamaica. No doubt PFM has technical aspects, but political leadership is key, and to have impact, you really need both. And Jamaica's kind of leading the way, showing, providing a great example of country best practice. So thank you for that. Let us then turn to June Nyakahuma, who is of the Macroeconomic Policy Department, Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development of Uganda, who will give us her perspectives. And we're particularly interested in the challenges of interagency coordination and why that's so important for NDC revision and integrating climate into PFM systems. So June, over to you, please.
Thank you, Christian, for the great introduction. And good morning and good afternoon, everyone that's watching. I'll be presenting Uganda's experience in reviewing and implementing NDCs. So I'll go straight to the importance of interagency coordination. And we've observed coordination is key to optimizing the benefits of climate action because it provides a clear connection with national priorities. And it's also crucial to ensuring that the proposed policies and sector interventions can be implemented accordingly. Next slide, please, Krista. So I'll delve straight into how Uganda has leveraged on interagency coordination. And we've also registered many achievements in planning and budgeting as a result of that interagency coordination. When we speak about climate change, we realize it cuts across many sectors and it also involves many stakeholders, both state and non-state actors. As Uganda, the Ministry of Water and Environment is the lead agency by virtue of its mandate to develop and strengthen Uganda's implementation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and its Kyoto Protocol. So it's basically also responsible for implementing Uganda's intended nationally determined contributions. But since climate change cuts across many sectors and there's many aspects to it, to improve coordination and mobilize resources and also make sure that there's a clear connection of climate strategies with NDC, with national priority policy priorities, a tripartite arrangement was created with three focal points to spearhead NDC revision and implementation. And these focal points cover Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, the Ministry of Water and Environment, specifically the Climate Change Department, and the National Planning Authority. Additionally, an institutional framework for climate action has been established through the National Climate Change Policy. And at the top of this institutional framework, there's a Policy Committee on Environment where the Minister of Finance is represented. And there's also the National Climate Change Advisory Committee, which is a technical committee that advises on all matters related to policy implementation and climate action. And lastly, Ministry of Finance, in its capacity as the National Designated Authority for the Green Climate Fund, has established an interministerial committee on climate finance to advise on matters related to the Green Climate Fund. The Deputy Secretary to the Treasury of the Ministry of Finance is chair to this Green Climate Fund. So that also helps in coordination from the ministry side. So speaking of the interagency coordination, we've registered many achievements as a result, and we hope that many countries will realize as they review their NDCs and then plan the next set of NDCs that coordination is key, as you know, climate cuts across many sectors and involves many stakeholders. So as a result of operationalization of such coordination mechanism, the NDC revision is being done in an intersectoral manner and a multi-stakeholder manner at national and subnational levels, including non-state actors. As such, Government of Uganda has received a Climate Action Enhancement Package, support through 8 partners to support NDC revision and formulation of the country's 2030 long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategy. The achievements realized from interagency coordination are not only limited to NDC revision and implementation, they also cut across to other aspects of climate change that could help, you know, leverage the agenda as a country. So as a tripartite arrangement, we realize that PFM, public finance management legislations and regulations, are also very important when it comes to implementation of NDCs, and they provide a stage for political discussion. I believe having a buy-in politically is very important, and when the laws also state what we have to do to implement climate change in our policies, it's very easy to take the discussions forward. So our Public Finance Management Act of Uganda 2015 has a provision for a fiscal risk statement in every year's budget, of which we are supposed to speak about disasters that arise from climate change. As Uganda, we have many of these disasters: floods, landslides, and severe droughts, they greatly impact the economy. So the PFM Act also states that we need to put some money aside in a contingency fund to cater for these natural disasters as they arise. And this is linked to implementation of NDCs as well. So as a result of stepping up using legislation and regulations, we've realized some outcomes like a climate change budget tagging manual, which is going to help incorporate climate actions into budgeting and planning, and the climate change bill to improve financing and budgetary arrangements for climate change. Both of these documents are being finalized, but it's a great step in our work as Uganda to combat climate change. So lastly, as a result of involvement as a tripartite, it has led to the upcoming National Development Plan 3 of Uganda, which is a 5-year rolling development plan that's championed by the National Planning Authority to include a chapter on climate change. And this can be leveraged for annual planning across all sectors. And next slide, please. So central to, on top of improving coordination to mainstream NDCs, I think it's also important to note that economic analysis is important, and central to economic analysis is macro-fiscal assessments. In Uganda, along the PFM cycle, there are so many tools that can be used as entry points, into assessing macro-fiscal impacts. And some of these tools include the budget framework paper, which speaks about fiscal risks. Unfortunately, at this point, we only speak about them in a qualitative manner, but this opens up a stage for including climate change risks in the annual budgeting process. And going forward, we have a fully fledged macro modeling unit in the macroeconomic policy department, and we are working on improving our macro fiscal assessments and quantifying them so that we can adequately provide for them in the annual budgets. The Ministry of Finance, as well as the National Planning Authority, work together with the World Bank as well to produce a natural capital accounting issues paper and country adjusted macroeconomic indicators report. These indicators fed into the quantitative estimates for the National Development Plan, and will also incorporate the contribution of natural assets and ecosystem services to the economy. So as Uganda, we really depend on natural capital and natural resources for the economy. Agriculture is key to the economy, things like forestry as well. And as we go into the oil production phase, it's important for us to assess our capital assets, our natural capital assets, and use them sustainably for future generations. So to conclude my presentation on behalf of Uganda, the tripartite mechanism that was formed is tasked to improve coordination across stakeholders, and this will ensure alignment of policies during the revision process and as we develop the next set of NDCs. I would like to thank the NDC Partnership Country Office and the NDC Partnership Office as well, and the National Planning Authority and the Climate Change Department of the Ministry of Water and Environment for assisting in this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, June. Very much appreciated. Thank you for the motivation that you're giving all, and that Uganda is giving all on the importance of coordination and leading by example on how in the process of undertaking an NDC review, the intersectoral and multi-stakeholder approach really is a central part of the process, and Uganda is really leading by example there. So let us turn to Ireland, to Paul Ryan from the International Finance Division, Ministry of Finance, Ireland, who will share with us some insights on how the Ministry of Finance can include the NDC targets in budget formulation and execution. Over to you, Paul.
Okay, Christian, thank you, and thank you, colleagues, for delighted to be taking part in the workshop, and very inspired by some of the earlier speakers, the two ministers, and indeed very, very interesting presentations by our colleagues to date. Given the time, I'll jump straight in. I'll just talk about basically the inclusion of NDC targets in budget formulation and execution. We primarily did this using green budgeting, and we're very strongly committed to this, to progressively implement it for a number of reasons. Number one, it gives far greater transparency on the level and effectiveness of the government's response to climate change. Number two, then, we believe it leads to greater policies and ultimately the achievement of our targets. And then lastly, it has facilitated reporting for investors in our sovereign green bond program, which we started in the last couple of years. And we have about $9 billion at this stage, US dollars. I think clearly demonstrating what the government is doing to address climate change and how effective this response are. They're absolutely critical in building public support for the difficult choices and trade-offs that are necessary for meeting our climate and energy targets. And again, this rings true with some of the political leadership that has been mentioned by some of the previous speakers. This is a very, very important factor for us. Again, we just see the budgetary process. It's not just a simple admin process. It basically reflects long-standing societal changes. And again, it's driven by political decisions. We have two steps to our process here. Number one involves identifying and tagging climate-friendly expenditure. And this also involves identifying the unintended environmental consequences of spending, particularly the environmental impact of the taxation system, more or less having sort of positive impacts and negative impacts of climate. The second step then involves determining the effectiveness of these policies, particularly in the case of harmful spending. We just want to see what the policy rationale for this spending is, and then what alternatives are there, what less environmentally damaging programs can achieve the same policy goals. We started green budgeting in 2018 after the government published a policy paper in late 2017. And this formalised Ireland's commitment to green budgeting as part of our national mitigation plan. And this is done against a backdrop of an increased government commitment to address climate change. As a first step, we developed a definition of climate-related spending and then tagged the various areas meeting this definition. And this has led to a table of climate-related expenditure, which is a key part of our budgetary documentation. And this has to be approved by the Minister and approved by Parliament. In the absence of an internationally accepted definition, we defined climate-related expenditure as, and I'm quoting here, any expenditure which promotes in whole or in part, whether directly or indirectly, Ireland's transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient and environmentally sustainable economy. We applied this definition very, very conservatively. We only included expenditure where all of the expenditure, or at least the majority of the expenditure for a particular government programme, supported improved climate and environmental outcomes. This actually led to the exclusion of a number of areas such as research and development and some climate-related expenditure across sectors of the economy, but we felt it's better to be conservative than be regarded as sort of greenwashing or leading to public scepticism. To counter this, we have been very, very open to green budgeting. We provide information in the budget booklet every year on basically how the expenditure table was derived and then to note the limitations of it. We did consider alternatives such as the Rio markers. We felt that they gave a less accurate picture of the government resources dedicated to climate change. However, we're still open to revising our methodology, and hopefully we'll reflect ongoing work at the OECD and indeed this coalition here. The integration of climate change tracking built upon work already done on gender diversity and equality budgeting, which we built into our budgets. In terms of recent developments, identifying the quantum of expenditure was basically only the very first step to implementing green budgeting. The next step, and the most difficult thing we had, is assessing the effectiveness of this expenditure against the stated policy goals. To start this in budget 2020, a decision was made to increase our carbon tax. We brought in a carbon tax in 2010, but we increased it by 30% last year. And we're going to increase it fourfold up to 2030. And the main thing we did here, and we had never done it before, was to ring fence the funding from this taxation to address particular objectives. Number one was to protect the most vulnerable from the effects of climate tax. The second one then was to fund a just transition into new fuels. And then the last one was to develop various measures to address climate change. And basically we put in place ex-ante performance metrics, basically see how these expenditure programs will be done in terms of getting additional funding from carbon tax, but also then to push this out to other areas of expenditure. And we're doing this for future carbon price rises, and then also then for future budgets as well. Essentially what we want to do is to use the allocation of the carbon tax revenues for incentives for government departments to develop better targeted and more evaluated expenditure programs, basically using a sort of a carrot and stick approach to expenditure. Ultimately, what we want to do is to widen this impact analysis beyond the measures funded by carbon tax to all expenditure across the Irish government. We've also built in then the UN SDG goals in relation to these performance metrics. In terms of lessons, first and foremost, this is a very iterative process. It takes a lot of time to do it. So the challenge is basically, number one, how best to try and capture the scale of financial resources used. It's a very obvious question, but again, it's actually quite difficult. And as I said earlier, we have to try and capture sort of the positive impact, basically putting money into climate related actions, but also the negative actions of any government expenditure can actually damage the environment. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, evaluating the impact of expenditure is a big issue and something we're grappling with at the moment. And then the third challenge then is how to present this in a sort of easily understandable format to the public, the parliament, and then government as well, to make sure that basically people understand how we're using the money and is there better ways to use it. And then the last challenge then is to incentivize government departments to develop programs that address climate action across all its aspects. And as I said earlier, we hope to work with the OECD, the World Bank, and indeed the Climate Coalition in developing our methodologies here. In recent weeks, we've had a number of changes. We've had a new government that's come in at the end of June, and basically it is very, very strong commitment to climate action, just reflects public opinion, but also the election results of an election in March. It took several months to develop a new coalition government. The government has a programme for government to put in place for the next 5 years, and there are 200 commitments. Over 50% of the commitments in the programme are on climate action, and these will impact upon our NDC in the annual budget process. And again, it'll build upon our green budgeting work. Some of the key commitments to be delivered over the government's first 100 days include legislation on climate action targets. It's to be built into legislation that government departments and agencies, etc., working with the private sector have to develop targets and then put in place measures that will actually will progress towards our climate and energy targets, and these will be built into the annual budget. We've also included initiatives such as the Climate Action Fund, again, which will target money for particular climate action measures, and then decarbonisation targets for each government department. And overall, we will have a 5-year carbon budget. All of these will drive a new economic plan, which aims to significantly increase our ambition on climate and energy targets to secure a more sustainable future. And this will result in a far deeper and wider inclusion of NDCs in budget formulation and execution. So by this time next year, I'll have a completely different narrative. We'll have this embedded fully across all the budget process. And again, it'll be trickled down into government departments, government agencies, etc., etc. And hopefully I'll get a chance to present on our first year's progress at this stage. Christian, I'll leave it there because I know you're cut for time, but if there's any questions or comments at the end, I'll gladly take them up. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. It continues to be very inspiring to hear Ireland's strong commitment to green budgeting and connecting this with the NDC formulation and implementation and all the different components. It's a very challenging area, and Ireland's example, I think, gives great encouragement to all to take this on and move forward with it. So let's move forward to Paula Sharina Alvarez, who's Assistant Secretary of the Department of Finance in the Philippines, and hear her perspective on climate budget tagging with PFM systems, and how the Philippines has approached this. Over to you, Paula.
Thank you, Christian, and I hope everyone is having a good day. So to keep it short, we would like to thank the Coalition for helping the Philippines present its country progress on how it has been dealing with climate budget tagging. So we would also like to thank Lorena and Pekka for their leadership. And maybe to start off, we could have the presentation shared on the screen. There, okay. So next slide, please. So to give you a brief background, the Philippines is a very vulnerable country to the effects of climate as well as to effects of disasters. So roughly the estimates is that around 4.12 billion is lost due to, around 4.12 billion is actually estimated to implement mitigation actions for energy, forestry, industry, and transport across from 2015 to 2030. And to illustrate how vulnerable the Philippines is to the effects of climate, past few years have demonstrated that natural disasters such as typhoons Ketsana, Parma, Washi, Bofa claimed over 3,000 lives and affected 10 million people. And this has caused economic damages and losses amounting to approximately $5.77 billion. And Super Typhoon Yolanda alone claimed over 6,200 lives and has cost the economy approximately $5.71 billion or $12.87 billion in damages, hampering economic growth by about 0.9% in 2013 alone. And it is estimated that in the years to come, the effect of climate and the intensity of typhoons are actually increasing. So because of this, the Philippines has instituted different kinds of tools to mitigate its risks to disasters and the effects of climate. So next slide, please. One of these tools is the climate change expenditure tagging system. So this system aims to have a more transparent and accountable budgeting to show the government where it has been spending money or how it has been spending money in relation to climate investments and expenditures for mitigation and adaptation. So next slide, please. Okay. So the key features of this budget tagging system is that it incorporates planning and prioritization in the budget process, as well as analysis, transparency, and accountability. So in these areas, what we do is we require the submission and tagging of climate change expenditures in the national budget call. So during the budget cycle, which actually is starting now, the Department of Budget and Management calls on the different government agencies like the Energy Department, the Economic Development Planning, Public Works, to tag in their budget proposals, which are mitigation and adaptation projects. And the Climate Change Commission tags all of this through a system that would include various codes that would show government where its money is actually going in terms of climate adaptation and mitigation. So next slide, please. So to start off, the climate change expenditure tagging wasn't always a part of government system. It was incorporated early on in 2013 in order to empower the Department of Budget and Management to actually call on other government agencies together with the Climate Change Commission to incorporate adaptation and mitigation projects in their budget proposals. So next slide, please. So in the process, the Department of Budget and Management is the lead in the tagging of the budget proposals, as well as the Climate Change Commission, who actually identifies which areas should be adaptation and mitigation. So in some areas, a project could actually be, for example, for agriculture, like irrigation, and this can actually fall it could actually fall into two categories, adaptation and mitigation. So it is the Climate Change Commission who identifies which among the project proposals of different government agencies actually fall in mitigation and adaptation. So aside from that, the DILG, or Department of Interior and Local Government, helps local governments prioritize climate tagging. So they help give technical assistance or capacity building for local government officials and their staff to incorporate climate budget tagging in their budget systems as well. So next slide, please. So because of this process, the government was able to actually quantify how much of its expenditure or how much of the budget included in the General Appropriations Act of the government are actually going into climate mitigation and adaptation. So it actually points to government agencies, how much they have already spent on these adaptation and mitigation measures. And it also shows finance ministers, for example, how much is needed from private and public finance. So what are your other sources of finance aside from your General Appropriations Act or the government budget in order to fast track or in order to mainstream climate adaptation and mitigation efforts? So next slide, please. So what have we learned? Next slide, please. Skylar?
Sorry, we're just experiencing technical difficulty. Give me just 1 second.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so so what have the Philippines learned from climate expenditure tagging? So through the implementation of the climate change expenditure tagging in the Philippines, we have learned that this is a tool to assess the status of the country's national and local response to climate change and on evaluating the effectiveness of the country's institutional framework on climate change. So with this, the government identifies its climate change expenditure. It was able to have informed policy decision among its oversight agencies, like, for example, the Economic and Development Authority and Department of Finance. So through the budget tagging system, we can actually see which areas in mitigation and adaptation need more financing. What are the other forms of financing that we can include, which I think is another Helsinki principle that is a subject for another webinar. So aside from this, it also promotes convergence in that it developed a unique typology wherein each project or each proposal would have a typology that would show us which are aligned with the National Climate Change Adaptation Program. So before the year starts, your Economic and Development Authority already releases its priority programs and projects. So through the typology system, there's convergence and we avoid repetition between, for example, the energy department and the transport department on which areas they should focus on. So since climate change cuts across all government agencies, there are times when your, for example, Public Works Ministry and your Agriculture Ministry could have overlapping mandates for project proposals that are related to mitigation and adaptation. So through the convergence system of the typology, we can actually avoid repetition, or we can harmonize between these two departments, which are climate change, adaptation, and mitigation, and how can we tweak them to better manage fiscal budget. So aside from that, it also facilitates your country's readiness. So next slide, please. Okay, so through the climate change expenditure tagging system, we could actually see which sectors need more initiatives for NDC implementation. So for example, we're also working with the World Bank for the Partnership for Market Readiness, wherein we're trying to come up with carbon pricing instruments for us to incorporate in our NDC target proposals, so that we can know which sectors lack more investments or which sectors could be subject to carbon pricing instruments. Like, for example, the energy department, how do we create carbon pricing instruments that would not hamper energy security, but would at the same time promote the increase in renewable energy resources? So we harmonize our other NDC implementation policies with what is actually being appropriated in the budget of the government. So next slide, please. So to show the Philippines' commitment to increasing its or in implementing its nationally determined contribution, we also participate in other platforms such as the ASEAN, the APEC, which Lorena and the other countries are also members of. We are also working with the UK Embassy in Manila for its Prosperity Fund, wherein we're trying to have livable cities and we're trying to mainstream climate finance through incorporation of, for example, the green bond system, the ASEAN green bond standards, how do we green investment portfolios. So these are all parts of the other cooperation platforms that the finance department is working together with other government agencies such as the Climate Change Commission and other line agencies. So with that, I end my presentation, and I hope if there are other questions, it would be included in the Q&A. Thank you. Back to you, Christian.
Thank you, Paula, and thanks for staying on so late in the night in the Philippines. I know the time zone issues are challenging, but we really appreciate you sharing the experience of the Philippines and climate budgeting, starting with the budget call and all the way through to the different components. So let us turn to Laura Marcela Ruiz Daza of the Office of the Vice Minister, Ministry of Finance, Colombia, where there are exciting initiatives underway, and to hear how Colombia has approached the monitoring and evaluation of climate finance within PFM systems. So over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Christian. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Laura Ruiz. I'm advisor to the Deputy Minister of Finance. I'm delegated to coordinate the plan on climate change and sustainable development. I'm going to start explaining the main elements of the plan so you can have the big picture in which we are working on. Next slide, please. Okay, so as you see in this slide, there are three components or pillars. The first on the left is related to knowledge building, which includes macroeconomic forecasting, in general, economic models or the data that help us understand or estimate impacts, costs, contingent liabilities, and risks related to climate change. It also includes the NDC update because it gives us new inputs to estimate costs related with mitigation and adaptation measures, so we can have an idea of how many financial resources we have to mobilize to comply or achieve our commitments or goals. The second pillar in the middle refers to tools and mechanisms on how we can implement and materialize our objectives. So it includes economic instruments as fiscal or market instruments, let's say the carbon tax, an ETS, to internalize externalities produced by emissions or contamination. We also have the Clean Growth and Sustainable Development Bill, which the ministry is planning to present to the Congress this year. It also includes the financial system, considering that the private sector will play a critical role in mobilizing climate finance. And related to green bonds, now we have working on the framework for the issuance of public and private green bonds. There are also green budget mechanisms and the taxonomy, which I'm going to focus on later. The last pillar, financing green, on the right, refers to the objectives on tracking climate change and protecting the environment. So meeting our goals will require unprecedented investment in green and low carbon technologies, services, and infrastructure. So green finance will help us to provide the flows of capital we need to comply with our commitments. Next slide, please. Thank you. So related to the first pillar, which includes analysis to define costs and amount of resources needed to be mobilized, we have a comparison here between the financial resources required and the current investment. In blue, we have public investment, and the white area is private investment. So we can see there are still gaps of financing resources that need to be covered. Colombia must increase investments in mitigation by $810 million annually to reduce emissions by 20%, which is our current NDC. Next slide, please. In terms of just public finance, this graph shows flows that have been effectively mobilized for each sector. For example, land use, energy, risk management, transport. So the challenge is to increase resources for each sector. As I already mentioned, we still have a big gap to meet our goals and to comply with the Paris Agreement, and it requires greater public and private financial efforts. Next slide, please. So referring to the second pillar, one of the tools used to determine and to track investments and to identify projects that are aligned with Colombia's objectives and international commitments is a taxonomy. Now the government is working on a unified taxonomy that could provide market signals that improve confidence about climate change projects. The work includes the National Planning Department, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Finance, and the Financial Superintendency. And this will improve transparency in terms of green bonds and the financial sector investments, and not just bonds. It will be a clear signal of what projects fit the country objectives in terms of climate change and sustainable development. And it also will allow us to comply with our climate finance commitments, because we will be capable of tracking the effective resources mobilized in mitigation and in adaptation. Next slide, please. So finally, regarding the third pillar, that is financing green, we have these objectives: accelerating finance to support the delivery of Colombia's carbon targets and clean growth. It, of course, includes a Paris Agreement and including financial sector engagement, aligning private and public sectors' financial flows with clean, environmentally sustainable and climate resilient growth, to facilitate the monitoring and tracking of green investments focused on environmental sustainability goals, and as well as the identification of activities and gaps for the targeting of resources. And finally, increasing environmental standards that contribute to market transparency regarding green spending and investments and avoiding greenwashing. That's all. I need to be brief because we are short of time.
Laura, thank you so much for your intervention and for sharing Colombia's clear approach to structuring the way forward. Very good to see the different components, knowledge, tools, financing coming together, and we look forward to seeing the progress of the Clean Growth and Sustainable Development Bill in Colombia. So thank you for your intervention. Let me turn to back to Trevor Anderson, who, as I introduced previously, is Principal Director of the Economic Management Division of the Ministry of Finance and Public Service in Jamaica, for some key takeaways from the report and to wrap up this portion of the discussion on the report. Trevor, over to you, please.
Okay. Thank you, Christian. And I'm cognizant of the fact that we are very short on time. One of the scarce resources, of course, is time. So let me see if I can do justice. My presentation will be short, and I'll try to just simply hit the key points. Next slide. So in terms of key takeaways from the report on national determined contributions and the role of ministers of finance, I must take a second and acknowledge the work of my co-champion Uganda, as well as the support and work put in by our coalition partners, Chile, Colombia, Ireland, and of course the Philippines, and our institutional partners, NDC partnership, as well as the World Bank. So let me jump right in. Some of the key takeaways: ministries of finance can improve NDCs, first and foremost in terms of assessing the first generation NDCs, looking at the challenges, and to learn from the errors or mistakes, and to identify ways of making improvements so that the second round generation NDCs can hit the ground running, so to speak. It's important to improve first generation NDCs from a financial perspective. It's important to highlight the fact that ministries of finance play a very critical role in terms of guiding the systematic and macroeconomic analysis around these projects and how they align with national budgets. It's also important in terms of ministries of finance providing the fiscal context. It's important to recognize that there are resource constraints. Jamaica is one of those countries which are operating under a fiscal responsibility framework. And as such, we have fiscal targets to meet, including debt, fiscal budget targets, etc. So when we are looking at NDCs, these projects, we need to be able to find creative ways to fit where there are challenges, to fit a particular NDC into the budget process. And it may be that a particular NDC may need to be implemented over time as opposed to over a shorter period, depending, of course, on the particular fiscal constraints. And the constraints would, of course, have been made worse by the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic. In terms of support and implementation, ministries of finance have a central role in mainstreaming the NDCs, as I said, into the annual budget cycles. So we're talking about budget tagging, parliamentary committees, annual reviews, monitoring and evaluation, etc., which a particular chart later on will demonstrate. As well as ministries of finance are also important in terms of providing critical inputs for resource mobilization, resource allocation, and assessment of these NDCs. Next slide. Again, it has to be reinforced that ministries of finance need to demonstrate that strong leadership as it relates to mainstreaming climate change. And it's important that the ministries of finance are involved, because with the support of the Ministry of Finance, the probability of success is much higher. And it strengthens the realization of climate targets and of course the benefits from these climate change initiatives. Ministries of Finance can also help to create an effective and achievable NDCs, as I said before, by providing reliable costing and macro assessments. Again, we need to bear in mind, this is what has come out of it, the whole matter of the fiscal profile, the fiscal space. Everything hinges around not just achieving the climate targets, but the climate targets must be achieved within the context of the need of the particular country to also achieve its fiscal targets. As I said before, Jamaica is one of those countries where we're operating under fiscal rules.
Apologies.
Yes.
If we're very tight on time. If you could wrap up in the next minute or two, or we risk losing our next speaker.
Okay.
Appreciate your help on this. Apologies for the interruption.
Right. So the next slide. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide sums up the budgeting process, and it also shows the points of intervention that ministries of finance can take. Next slide. Finally, what's next? MOF leadership and coordination must increase, and it must remain high on the priorities. Jamaica would like to urge, in terms of a call to action, that countries submit their second generation NDCs to the UNFCCC. The time is now for collective climate action. COVID-19 has highlighted the need for green growth, and as we seek to build back better, we also will be building resiliency. Global initiatives and partnerships are important, and to that extent, I would like to again thank the NDC partnership and the World Bank for the assistance provided, and that will be continued in the near future. So thank you very much. I realize the time is up on me. That's my presentation.
Thank you so much, Trevor. No doubt the preparation of NDCs is a learning process, and countries are continuing to get better at this, and we look forward to a set of strongly enhanced NDCs going forward. And the presentations will be made available after the workshop, so participants can peruse at their leisure some of the details that, unfortunately, due to time constraints, we may have had to skip over. So apologies for that, Trevor. So we're very fortunate to have Amar Bhattacharya with us, who will say a few words on how ministries of finance can use the NDCs to guide green stimulus and low carbon transformation and development planning as we, in the post-COVID-19 world. So Amar Bhattacharya is with the Brookings Institution and also works with the Grantham Research Institute and as an advisor to the Coalition of Finance Ministers. We're delighted to have Amar with us. Over to you, Amar.
Thank you very much, Christian, and many apologies, Trevor, for rushing. There is a high-level financing for development dialogue going on in the United Nations today, and I was committed to that some time ago. But I think this conversation is extremely important, and so I very much wanted to join it. So I want to basically pick up very much on the themes that Trevor was mentioning right now, and particularly, how to think about the next generation of NDCs and to think about strengthening NDCs as an opportunity to really respond to the challenge of our time, which is responding to the COVID. And as you know, we prepared a paper for the coalition. James Ridge was very much involved in it, and Charlotte Taylor and James have helped with the preparation of this presentation. So if I could go to the next slide. So climate, when we started the first generation of NDCs, the intent was really a public statement on climate commitment. But what we have recognized since then is that climate is not a separate agenda, it's an integral part of the growth and development agenda. And if you take the 3 quotes from this recent paper of the NDC partnership and the World Bank for the coalition, I just quickly read them to you because I think they are extremely important. Bank of England, climate policy should not be seen in isolation, but should be considered an integral part of the broader policy agenda to promote economic growth, and I would add development. Second, NDCs often provide the window into the government's vision for areas of future economic growth and technology transformation. This is from the World Bank. And third, from the paper by Hepburn, Nick Stern, Joe Stiglitz, recovery packages that seek synergies between climate and economic goals have better prospects for increasing national wealth, enhancing productive human, social, physical, and tangible natural capital. And so what's the message from that? The message from that is essentially NDCs need to be anchored in long-term growth and development strategy, but also NDCs can be extremely powerful in helping to inform the decisions that we have to take in terms of priorities for recovery packages and priorities for long-term transformation. So there are some examples of these articulations of long-term strategies. In a climate sense, they are, of course, very much under the work that has been done in Principle 1 on long-term strategies. But I wanted to highlight 3, I think, very powerful examples. And you see that echoed in many of the presentations we heard from today. I wanted to highlight the Indonesia Low Carbon Development Initiative, which recognizes that climate, inclusive and sustainable growth are absolutely interlinked, and you need to think about that as a common strategy. There's a very recent paper that has been prepared on Brazil by the New Climate Economy, and I think that is also instructive in thinking about how you use long-term strategies and you think about the climate implications and climate co-benefits. But the most powerful really is the European New Green Deal. And it anticipated, in some sense, COVID. It recognized that as the EU president said, the European Green Deal is our new growth strategy. And not only did it put it out as a strategy, it put out a roadmap and it put out a financing plan, and that has then been built on in the post-COVID framework. And that is what we need to replicate all across the world as we think about now the strategy for ramping up and for transformation. So the NDCs really need to, in some sense, if you think aspirationally, and very much like the presentation suggested, and you saw that very much in both the Philippines and the Colombia presentation, I could not listen into all the others, but you need the NDCs to do 3 things. You need them to have articulated investment programs and projects that are consistent with the climate objectives, but are anchored in long-term growth and development strategy. Second, you need clear ambitions on the necessary policy frameworks. And third, you need a discussion of the financing implications. That is the primary reason why finance ministers should have a key role, because they are the ones who can play that integrative role. Yes, the NDC itself may go into a level of detail and will involve sector ministries, but the integrative frame, in my view, has to come from finance ministers. The second point I want to make very quickly is, and if you go to the next slide, this is slide 5, the COVID pandemic has completely changed, in some sense, the situation we are in. The situation is still unfolding, and unfortunately, the situation is still deepening. Emerging markets and developing countries came late into the COVID challenge, but now, in some sense, the impact is much more severe and the wherewithal of response much more constrained in emerging markets and developing countries. Immediate focus must be on stabilization and rescue, but it is not too late. Indeed, it is important in parallel to think about recovery packages, even in the COVID-constrained world, and behind that to think about the challenges of transformation to meet climate goals. If you move to the next slide, so basically recovery packages, just like the NDCs, have to have 3 elements. They have to have coherent strategy for the right investments. And here we need to blend climate with the other goals. We need to recognize the importance of economic multipliers. We need to recognize the central challenge of jobs, and we need to recognize the importance of speed. So if you take the NDCs, you have to apply some additional filters to ensuring that we have shovel-ready investments in place that actually serve the needs of the day. Second, this is a time to think about which policies need to be accelerated. And in the paper, we prepared, fossil fuel subsidies, carbon prices, regulations, and bailout conditionalities should deserve special attention. Finally, we need to ensure that we have the finance in place to support the recovery packages and to support NDCs for the transformative change. We know that the particular constraint we will be facing is fiscal space. And within fiscal space, there are 2 dimensions: debt constraints and financing constraints. Unlocking those will be very, very country specific, but will require international cooperation can help. For example, in dealing with illicit flows, for example, in dealing with international taxation. Second, we have to put in place better international financing mechanisms. And here, the role of the private sector will be key, but that private sector finance will only come into place in the new environment if we really ramp up development finance contributions, both from at the global level, but also at the national level. We have many, many examples, next slide, of green investments that can support a better recovery. And I think these are illustrative, but they are helpful suggestions that can be built on as countries move forward in thinking about what is appropriate in their space that can be done quickly. The last point I want to make is the integration of NDC into recovery packages will require very much, as Trevor pointed out, a focus on public financial management. But there are several tools that we have, highlight in the paper that can be helpful to finance ministries. Given the integration function, as the OECD has argued, the well-being lens is extremely important. It incorporates climate, but it looks at the other dimensions that finance ministers need to incorporate as they think about recovery packages. Green budgeting, as was mentioned, can be very, very useful in thinking about whether the expenditures meet a certain test. Third, the World Bank's project level guidance is extremely important. You can complement that also with sector level guidance. For example, on energy transition, for example, on land use and the like. And last but not least, we need to focus on resilience, because as Chile points out, as Philippines points out, this crisis will deplete, in some sense, the capacity and the capability of countries to respond to shocks, and ensuring that investments are both more resilient and that we are investing in tackling vulnerability or the capacity building up buffers will be very, very important. The last slide that I have is, very much taken from a World Bank note, which I think is a stylistically very useful way to think about the bridge between the NDCs and the interventions that would have to happen in the stimulus packages. Again, while sector ministries and the like will play an important role, ultimately, in my view, the integrative function must be performed by the ministries of finance. I'm sorry to speed this along, but since we are short on time, let me stop there. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you so much, Amar. We really appreciate you stepping out of your other prior commitment to join the discussion. And your insights are so valuable always, and we really appreciate the emphasis on climate being integral to economic growth and development, and NDCs and ministries of finance at the heart of this process. So from your intervention and those of other panelists, I think that gives us all a great deal of motivation and inspiration going forward. So it remains just for me to thank all the panelists and all the participants for joining this workshop, and a big thank you, a big shout out to the NDC partnership for all that they have done and the whole team in putting this workshop together, and all the leadership and support on this critical agenda. So let me turn it over to Pablo Vieira, who's Global Director of the NDC Partnership, for any closing thoughts and to close out the workshop. So thank you all very much.
Thank
over
you,
to you,
Christian, and great job, great event. Extremely happy to have heard from so many countries, and of course, an incredible closing by Amar. So I'll just take a couple of minutes. I want to thank the ministers, all the colleagues that have participated, everyone here today to discuss the Helsinki Principles, and specifically to discuss Principle 6 and its paper, and to showcase the importance of the role of ministers of finance in supporting the implementation, the enhancement, and the development of NDCs. I would like to also thank, in particular, the governments of Uganda and Jamaica for their leadership under Principle 6, and applaud their ministries of finance for their work to implement ambitious NDCs. Definitely, we need to understand that it is in the DNA of the NDC partnership to work with ministries of finance and planning. That's why they are focal points of the partnership. In this way, we can ensure that the Paris Agreement and in general climate action is mainstreamed across national planning and budgeting processes and becomes a priority and a responsibility from and for the entire government. In that sense, the work of the Coalition of Finance Ministers cannot be overestimated. Thanks to the co-chairs and the Secretariat for the important work they have done in advancing the Helsinki Principles for climate action. With the Coalition of Finance Ministers and the NDC partnership working so closely together, we have the opportunity to link climate and national development together to promote transformational change on the ground. This is more important than ever, as we have heard from all interventions today. A green recovery and the NDC implementation and enhancement go hand in hand. So in response to broader impacts of COVID-19 pandemics, countries are developing recovery packages that address a wide range of rapidly changing economic, social, and environmental conditions. And in response to country needs, the NDC partnership is taking action during this pivotal moment to ensure climate change is fully considered and mainstreamed into countries' economic recovery measures. This summer, the NDC partnership launched the Economic Advisory Initiative to support governments in preparing climate-compatible recovery packages that are aligned with their NDCs and with their climate priorities. To date, around 40 economic advisors will be deployed to 30 countries around the world, supported by 12 of our members. These economic advisors will support ministries of finance and planning to incorporate climate ambition into the recovery and/or national plans that are responding to COVID-19. They will assess the impact of the pandemic on their NDCs and on the process of updating their NDCs. And they will identify low carbon, climate resilient, shovel-ready projects as recovery measures and mobilize national and international financial resources to implement them. So as we move this initiative forward through the next year, we look forward to future opportunities to work with the Coalition of Finance Ministers to share lessons learned and best practices, and to enhance interministerial collaboration on climate action. I thank you all again for your contribution and for today's event, and wish you all a good rest of your day and your week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo. And I should perhaps just mention that on the Q&A we did receive questions, but these were answered in the chat. And at this point we're past time. So thank you all very much for staying on past the scheduled close. And on behalf of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, we thank the NDC partnership again, and all of you for participating and the excellent work going forward. So thank you, and this brings the workshop to a close. Goodbye.
Thank you.